Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm the grouchy historian, and we're going to cover here in video number 5 of our series on AP US history, the period known as, well, they just call it the Industrial Revolution from 1865 to 1898. Although I think we'll see, as from our earlier videos, that the Industrial Revolution has already been going on for quite a while here. But during this period, we see a tremendous amount of growth in new industries, in what they call the Gilded Age, the age of laissez-faire capitalism, and the beginnings of America are kind of reemerging from its isolation after the Civil War, taking its first steps onto the world stage prior to the dawn of the 20th century. So there's a little bit of overlap with the previous video we did, which where we covered a lot of the settlement of the West, the final wars with the Plains Indians, and the introduction of new inventions, particularly the railroad, that begin to bring America together and offer the ability for large amounts of goods to reach market. Along with this, what we see are the beginnings of what we would call industrial titans in steel, oil, railroads, of course, again, where we see the beginning of some economic theories, such as economies of scale, where you have these companies that produce commodities, like petroleum is another new industry that comes online, but they're able to produce enough of the product that they can turn a profit. This, of course, is also the era loosely labeled as the era of the robber baron, because there's very little government oversight, government regulation of commerce at this point. So we see the emergence of monopolies, not the game with Boardwalk and Park Place, but the actual attempt by certain titans of industry like John D. Rockefeller or Andrew Carnegie to literally take over entire industries through either horizontal and vertical integration. Now, you probably talked a little bit about these in your book. So I kind of look at these as you either control the entire market or you control all of the means of production. So I would look at these in modern sense. There is in a real sense, the way I would interpret it, that let's use computers, because this is what easiest thing. To me, Microsoft is a perfect example of a horizontal monopoly. Pretty much most of the PCs in the world run on Microsoft Windows, some version. Consequently, Microsoft has had a lot of antitrust suits from the federal government over the years. We're going to talk about those in just a second, over their willingness to open up their operating system to allow other companies to compete. Now, for the most part, the marketplace is dominated because users want one operating system on their computers with standards. But where Microsoft got in trouble is they used their near monopoly in operating systems to try to force competitors for, let's say, web browsers. Not sure all of you are old enough to remember the days of Netscape and Explorer and the very beginning of Firefox, but there was a lot of suits brought forth that Microsoft was fixing their operating system to work better with their browser than somebody else's. Vertical integration, I would look at as my friends at Apple. Apple controls all aspects of their computer. They make the hardware, they make the software, they make the applications, and they control all what they call the customer experience, but what other people would say, you don't really mess with Apple computers very much, right? You don't. They have the software that's written as software, but you don't mess around with the Apple operating system or the Apple hardware typically. That's kind of the example I use. I'm sure the book uses the other, talking about the steel industry or the oil industry, but to kind of put it in a perspective for modern history students, that's what I do it. However, now, of course, you have the beginnings of government intervention, where starting off with the Sherman Antitrust Act. Clearly, a monopoly is not necessarily good for consumers, because if I'm the only guy selling oil, I can sell it for whatever I want, and you got to pay it, right? And I can use that monopoly position to crush anyone who tries to compete with me. So the Sherman Antitrust Act was the very first instance of government intervention, as we're going to see in the next video, led to a huge era of trust busting, as they called it in the early part of the 20th century, to kind of break up trust for steel, oil, the railroads, to allow more competition, which ultimately is better for consumers. This, of course, is still the era. Railroads were the mass transportation of the time. Of course, we do see some early inventions of the automobile. They're not mass produced yet, but we're going to see the beginnings of the automobile as a viable alternative to the old horse and buggy. But we certainly see mass production taking off at this point. We see the genesis of what will become the production line of the early 20th century. Along with this, of course, as these centers of production and manufacture grow, they cause an increase in cities. And of course, inevitably, politicians follow. This is the era of the political machines that rule the larger cities, and again, form basically a political monopoly in these cities, where they control, because at this time, public positions, right, government jobs were very much handed out by the party bosses. They were a means of spoils, as the saying goes, where they could hand them out as political favors to their supporters. So we see a lot of corruption. Clearly, not much has changed there in 100 years. In a lot of these big cities, as these political machines dominate politics. Of course, another factor, as we have these large growths of industry with wage jobs and people moving into the city off the farms to take wage earning jobs, is the conflict between labor and capital intensifies. Here you really see the growth of the first unions, the what will become it when they merge, the AFL and the CIO. So originally you have unions for skilled labor, followed by unions of sort of production line workers that are not necessarily skilled in terms of being machinists or welders or something like that, but they are, trained to do their part of the assembly line. There were serious violence and battles as the conflict between labor and capital intensifies. And again, as I mentioned in the last film, this is where you see the rise of socialist political parties. You see the rise of populism, where they're trying to get better wages, better working conditions, and better living conditions in these cities. Along with this, Jim Crow rules the South. This is the era where you have the Supreme Court case known as Plessy versus Ferguson, which establishes the notion of separate but equal. If any of you have ever seen the pictures of the two water fountains next to each other, the one says whites only, the one says colored only. This is the era of Jim Crow in the South, brought about by Plessy, ultimately enshrined, we'll say, by Plessy versus Ferguson. This is the era of sharecropping as a means of agriculture, which is essentially a form of serfdom, where freed slaves, many of them still living on the plantations where they used to be slaves, now rent back the property that they're growing their crops on from their former plantation owners at very high rates. They basically are caught in a cycle of credit and debt to where they can't get out of it. So, and of course, the end of Reconstruction and the rise of the Southern whites back into power, it pretty much eliminates blacks as a political force in the South for about the next half century. The West finally becomes closed and settled, as it were. As we discussed in the last video a little bit, the Homestead Act, passed by the Lincoln administration in 1862, promises land for settlers who want to go out west and settle land, work the land for a certain period of time, and then it becomes theirs very cheaply. This is a way to help settle some of those plains areas that are not necessarily perhaps as aesthetically pleasing as the eastern areas, but they are tremendously good farmland. And the American plains becomes essentially the American breadbasket, where you have, the purple waves of grain, and the corn is as high as an elephant's eye and all that good stuff. Again, the reason that the West is able to be settled and that the Homestead Act is able to economically work is, of course, railroads to get these goods to market in a timely manner and allow farmers to make a living. The last wars with the Native Americans, again, brought about by railroads, the U.S. Army, as always, and the near destruction of the buffalo herds helps push the remaining Plains Indians tribes and some tribes in the Southwest onto reservations by about 1890, with the massacre of natives at Wounded Knee in 1890 being essentially the last act of the wars with Native Americans on the plain. This ushers in the era of what they call the Gilded Age. This is where you see a reform of the federal civil service system into pretty much the form that it has today. Again, government jobs, civil service jobs, all the way back to the beginning of the country, were used as a form of patronage for one political party or the other. So if for example, the Republicans were in power, they would put all of their guys in the government jobs. When the Democrats took power, they would put all their guys in the government jobs. This was not necessarily a good model for government, because you had your political cronies in the jobs, not necessarily the most technically competent people. So one of the things that the Congress does is they start to establish sort of a permanent civil service system, that these jobs now become more professionalized, as it were, and less the soccer ball between whichever political power is in political party is in power at the time. The other issue that really comes to the forefront here, and it always comes down to money, is the argument between silver and gold coinage. At this time, of course, there's not the Federal Reserve System. We'll get to that the next video. So there's always a tension, because, of course, constitutionally, only the United States government can coin money, I believe is what the Constitution actually says. At this time, the government is not enamored with paper currency. They did it during the Civil War because they had to, but for the most part, the government and bankers like to have what is called hard currency. That's currency in either gold or silver. Now, you typically have more silver in circulation than more gold. So there's an argument about whether they should coin silver or coin gold. This is the eternal struggle between bankers and farmers, or in this case, between lenders and borrowers. Because, and I'm not an economist, I don't play one on TV, not going to pretend, but clearly as you inflate the money supply, money necessarily becomes a little less valuable, not something that bankers are in favor of, but certainly something that lenders are in favor of. So you're going to see, if you talk about the presidential candidacy of William Jennings Bryan and his very famous speeches on this topic, that there is a tremendous amount of tension over whether the government should mint silver or gold coins. Again, this topic, along with other topics relating to labor and capital and the rights of workers and everything, lead to the rise of the Socialist Party, epitomized by Eugene V. Debs, who runs for president several times during this era. And finally, most importantly, America starts to move into the world. During the time that we're settling the plains, filling in the country, as it were, minding our own business, doing business, because that's what America does, we do business. But now, because of the situation with Cuba, the U.S. grapples with the notion of imperialism. Cuba is, of course, the last vestige of Spanish colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. The Cubans began a very long revolt to gain their independence from Spain. When the USS Maine is sent into Havana Harbor in 1898, it explodes. Now, at the time, this explosion was blamed on the Spanish. We now know, of course, after having analyzed the wreck, that the explosion was caused by coal dust, because sails, of course, had gone out of fashion, and we now had steam-powered warships, but they were not oil-fired warships. They used coal. Coal dust, if it accumulates in a space, basically becomes an explosive vapor, and that is what we now understood sunk the Maine. However, it was blamed on the Spanish. America went to war, kicked the Spanish butt, and all of a sudden we find ourselves owning overseas territories, primarily Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, and I think that's about it. But now we have the relationship of, well, we're not really imperialists because we're Americans, and we don't really do this, but we have these territories that we're kind of in charge of, so what do we do with them? This is a very complicated issue as we go into the 20th century. We try to be a good neighbor in Latin America. We're actually probably semi-imperialistic with Latin America during this time. We certainly don't want the Europeans in here, but that doesn't mean we don't necessarily land the Marines every once in a while when we've got to take care of business. This will continue well into the 1930s when the Marines are sent in, when there's difficulties, let's just say, that need to be settled in Latin American countries, or occasionally the island nations of Haiti or the Dominican Republic. We also have a very complicated relationship with China and the Far East at this time. Of course, Matthew Perry's voyage to Japan in 1854 finally opened up the Japanese islands, who were way better isolationists than we ever were, to American trade. But more importantly, China begins its century, and if you've ever studied Chinese history, this is like the dark times for China, from about the mid 1840s until about 1949, when the communists take power, where the Chinese are the, we'll just call them the chew toys of the European powers, as they don't colonize China necessarily, but they set up spheres of influence and economic dominance to benefit themselves, not necessarily the Chinese. The US, of course, wants to have what they call an open door policy, which allows anybody and everybody to do business in China, to trade with China. We send a lot of missionaries to China. So the US begins a very complicated relationship with China, which grows during this period right around the turn of the 20th century, that is going to, in fact, significantly influence America's relationship with Japan prior to the US entry into World War II. So, contrary to popular belief, the US actually has a very long history with China, dating back to the late 19th century, when the US tried to be a good friend to China. It was a complicated relationship because, of course, there was still a great deal of what's the word I should say, racial superiority of the Europeans over the Chinese in terms of how they treated the Chinese, which of course the Chinese have not forgotten in 100 years. But the US, we'll just say, was the least bad of the Europeans and their relationship with the Chinese. So here's some terms and conditions. Again, not all inclusive, and there's a whole lot of names. We had a lot of presidents in this period, none of them particularly outstanding, you know. But again, the Sherman Antitrust Act, Plessy versus Ferguson, really excellent topics for essay questions or numerous multiple choice questions. Plus, of course, a couple other things. The suffrage movement begins to gain steam in this time. Of course, the first women's rights conference had been at Seneca Falls in 1848. But now we're going to see, again, as we move into the early 20th century, the first genuinely organized movement to give women the right to vote. So this is a pretty short chapter. The next chapter is going to be intensely long, but this sort of sets the stage as the US goes into the 20th century for what's going to be probably the most remarkable century of change in American history. So we'll see you with that video.